All right, so these are going to be your video notes on crime scene investigation. So this unit is all about what happens at a crime scene, the different people that show up, how the evidence is collected, the steps that are taken, um, and exactly what happens at a crime scene. Um, so this tells us what happens at a crime scene. And then, after we learn about the crime scene, the different types of evidence, how they are packaged up and processed, next unit we'll start learning about lab techniques, and then we'll go into specific types of evidence. So we're slowly working our way in. So I like to start these units off with using cases to talk about the specific topic. So our topic is crime scene investigation and types of evidence, way evidence is collected, processes and procedures that must happen at a crime scene in order to properly document everything and make sure evidence is collected correctly. So we're going to start learning about a case that came from 1966 in Colorado, in which the process that happened at the crime scene, it taught us some lessons about things that should happen properly at a crime scene. So again, this happened in 1966 in Colorado. You may have heard of it. It's a very famous case. It's the JonBenét Ramsey case. And this case taught investigators how it is important to secure a crime scene, because evidence can be lost if there aren't specific procedures or if those procedures aren't followed correctly. So, just a little bit of background on this story. So, police thought that the 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey had been kidnapped because her mother found a ransom note. So, they thought she had been kidnapped. They went there to investigate a kidnapping. And because of this, the police didn't search the house initially. They searched it 7 hours later after the kidnapping had been reported. So, they thought it was a kidnapping, therefore, they didn't search the house because they thought the little girl had been kidnapped. Later, 7 hours later, they finally searched the house. However, if the officer had actually searched the house when they showed up, they would have found the body of the murdered girl in the basement. So her body was in the basement the entire time. 7 hours went by, people moving throughout the house before they actually realized that it was an active crime scene. Um, so because they thought it was a kidnapping, they only taped out her room, not the entire house. So like I said, people are moving about this entire time, and that people moving all about made a large part of the crime scene contaminated. They didn't actually know which parts of the house might have contained important evidence, because again they thought it was a kidnapping. They were just looking at her room. Later, it wasn't even the police that found the body. It was the little girl's father, found her body. He wrapped her in a blanket and carried her back upstairs into the living room. By doing that, he possibly destroyed even more evidence that could have potentially identified the killer. So when a body is found, it should not be touched, disturbed, moved, or in any way. So of course, he is not a law enforcement officer. He hasn't been trained in this. He might not necessarily know that. But since the police did not tape off the house, search the whole house, didn't find the body, contamination happened. After the body was found, still, friends and family were allowed to move about the home freely. And they even specifically recalled cleaning the kitchen. They cleaned the kitchen. They could have been getting rid of evidence. After several hours, they finally blocked off the basement, and then 18 hours after the body was discovered, it was examined by a pathologist. And this case still remains unsolved to the day. And this begs the question if proper procedure had been established and followed for this particular case, there may have been evidence found that could have led to the killer. Again, they still don't know who killed this little girl. So this is going to be very important, especially in real life cases, that procedure is followed thoroughly. So we're going to start talking about crime scene investigation. So the goal of a crime scene investigation is to be able to recognize, photograph, document, and then properly collect any evidence that you have. Then the solving of the crime requires the evidence be pieced together to get an overall understanding of what happened. Typically, at a crime scene, anything can be considered evidence. It's better to consider something evidence and later find out it has nothing to do with your crime than to overlook it. I'm actually reading a book right now where the lady talks about she had no idea that a golf club they found on the side of the road had anything to do with the case she was investigating. And if they hadn't picked it up and collected it, that evidence would have never been found. So it's better to consider everything evidence than to, disclude something because you don't think it's important. All right, so the principle of exchange. This is going to be really, really important in investigations. The principle of exchange states that whenever two people, two objects, or a person and an object come into contact with each other, transfer occurs. Some type of transfer. It could be hair, skin cells, fibers. That should say pollen, not pollen. Pollen. Makeup. Literally, it can be anything. But whenever two things come into contact with one another, something is transferred. Material is transferred. These transferred materials or objects are considered trace evidence. And examples of trace evidence could be pet hair, human hair, fingerprints, tracked dirt, paint chips, fragments of objects, and drips of blood. So I know some examples, and this is for crimes, but also just in everyday life. I mean, I've went to my parents' house. My parents have a cat. The cat comes inside occasionally. The cat doesn't live inside. My parents don't really like for the cat to come in. So the cat's not really in the house that much, but sometimes it comes in, it runs in, whatever. Sometimes I'll go to my parents' house. I'll sit in the chair in the living room and I'll come home and find a piece of cat hair on me. I was never in contact with the cat. I didn't pet the cat. I had nothing to do with the cat, but I had cat hair on me because the cat touched the chair. It transferred to the chair. I sat in the chair. The hair transferred to me. Things are always exchanged. It can be very, very small. You might not even know it's there. But whenever two things come into contact, some type of evidence is exchanged. And this is called the Locard principle of exchange. So it states anytime two things come into contact, evidence is exchanged. Now, the type of evidence and the length of contact is going to determine how much is transferred. Again, it could be negligible, almost nothing, but sometimes it's very, very important. For instance, if something had happened to me, I don't know, hope it doesn't happen, but if something had happened to me and they found cat hair on my pants and they're like, well, she doesn't have a cat, then they might have started looking and they could figure out that maybe I was at my parents' house because they found that cat hair. So it helps you piece things together. Paint chips, car accidents can lead to paint chips being exchanged. And it can kind of give a history of where a person has been, what they've done. And the same goes for objects. So there's going to be two types of evidence that we're going to talk about, and we're going to practice this a little bit in class next week. The two are direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. So direct evidence is a proof that person has been at a crime scene. There are only two types of direct evidence: video footage, photographs of things happening, or eyewitness accounts. So direct evidence is the most damning type of evidence because it proves that a person was at a scene of a crime. Again, video footage, photos, audio, direct eyewitness accounts, so someone actually seeing someone doing them. And here's some examples here. So again, eyewitness accounts can be observer, it could be someone acting as a journalist, it could be documents or records that prove you were somewhere, video, audio, photos. Those are examples of direct evidence. Circumstantial evidence is indirect evidence that can suggest that somebody was at a crime scene. No one saw it, there is no proof, but it kind of ties you to the area. This kind of usually demonstrates some type of connection between a suspect and a crime, but the more circumstantial evidence you have, the better, because if there's just one piece of circumstantial evidence and it's not enough to prove, anything. So circumstantial evidence can be two types. It could be physical or it could be biological. So here are some examples. Physical evidence could be evidence not directly from a living organism. So fingerprints, footprints, impressions, marks. That's physical evidence. So for instance, they find a footprint at a crime scene, you have the same type of shoe. Circumstantial. It's physical because it's not from a living organism. It itself is not alive. So a fingerprint is not living. It's just something that came from what was living, so it is physical. Biological evidence is organic evidence that has DNA or was once alive, so blood, tissue, bodily fluids, plants, pollen, hair, all of these things have living cells. They are biological. And again, circumstantial. Please note, DNA is circumstantial. I could have been at the scene of a crime weeks before it happened and left DNA somewhere and not have been involved in the crime. Circumstantial. Evidence can also be split into two categories: class evidence or individual evidence. Class evidence is narrow things down to a certain group of individuals. So class evidence would be, I don't know, a type of shoe. Many people can have the same shoe that I have in the same size. Individual evidence narrows you down to one person. An example of that could be DNA. DNA is unique to one individual. So class narrows you down to a group of people. Individual narrows you down to one person. So at a crime scene, we always have many people working. They include police officers, crime scene investigators, detectives, medical examiners, pathologists, and attorneys. Typically, police officers are going to be the first to arrive at the crime scene. The first thing that they do is secure the scene and control what happens. Sometimes, depending on the case, they'll need to get a warrant to collect evidence, and if they need a warrant, that's when they call an attorney. Crime scene investigators are the individuals that document, take photographs, sketch the scene, and collect the evidence. Medical examiners are needed to help determine cause of death. Detectives conduct interviews and get information from investigators. And specialists may be called in if certain type of evidence is found there. So if you have bugs, they might call the entomologist. If you have blood, they might call the blood spatter analyst. So specialists are called in based on what's found at a crime scene and who is needed. So once you have the evidence, once it's found, it must be packaged properly. So packaging is very important to be sure that the evidence is not damaged. Anything small and dry is placed in a paper bindle. And the way that they do that is they follow these steps essentially to seal the piece of evidence in a small handmade envelope made out of paper. Again, that is only for small, dry evidence. Any wet evidence, and this includes things that have blood, even if it's dried blood or DNA, they are always placed in a paper container and sealed. Never, ever is wet evidence placed in plastic. That's going to cause DNA to degrade or mold, making it useless. So anytime wet evidence is found, a bloody t-shirt, anything that contain any type of biological material. So if someone was mugged and they think maybe the shirt contains the DNA from the attacker, the shirt is placed in a paper bag. If any type of bodily fluid, blood or otherwise, may be on something, it's always goes in paper so the evidence is kept intact. Otherwise, it could degrade and it would be useless. I'm sure, as you all know, in order to keep the evidence secure, it must be kept track of properly using chain of custody. Every piece of evidence has a form. Every time the evidence exchanges hands, the form must be signed and include the person from whom it came, who it's transferred to, and the time and date of which it was transferred. And this is kept on every piece of evidence. Anytime it changes hands, this chain of custody form must be signed. Okay, so that brings us to the 7 S's of an investigation. These are the 7 S stages that happen when you arrive at a crime scene. So, first, you secure the scene. The first person, police officer at the scene, secures the scene, tapes it off, makes sure that no one enters so nothing gets contaminated. They also call for help to get more people to come and help out. Step 2 is separate the witnesses. No one that witnessed the scene should be able to talk to each other. Witnesses should be separated and individually asked about the crime. So secure it, then you separate out your witnesses. The next step is to scan the scene. Examiners are going to look over the scene to see what areas may be priority. They also need to determine if there's a secondary scene. Secondary scene is where something else may have happened. So maybe I have footprints or a trail of something leading somewhere else. That is going to be a secondary scene. So scanning the scene is basically just overlooking it. You're going to see if there's any hazards you need to watch out for. Because at a crime scene, there could be hazards. Biological, there could be explosives, there could be weapons, and you need to identify if there's anything there that could harm you, what areas are going to be your top priority when you go in. So scanning, you're not entering, you're just overlooking. Then you're going to see the scene, and this is in which you take photos with measured points of reference. So you take photos of your evidence with measurements included. So, for instance, I'm going to measure how far the knife on the floor is from a certain fixed point, say from both walls. You want to know exactly with measurement where every piece of evidence is located and photograph it. The scene is also sketched. The crime scene investigator accurately sketches the scene to make note of the position of objects and evidence, and measurements are taken and it is drawn to scale. So this is very, very important. Drawn to scale with measurements of everything that was located at the crime scene. Now they actually search for evidence. We might have found some pieces, they might have been obvious, but we got to search to see if there's anything else. This is when a search pattern is used. There's many types of search patterns, we'll talk about them. You search for the evidence, everything is documented. This is where they might pull out the black lights to locate biological evidence as well. Then they're going to secure the evidence. We found the evidence, we've taken photos of it, we've measured it out, we've sketched it out. Now we're going to secure it, we're going to package it properly, seal it, and label it properly. Again, chain of custody is very important. Every piece, once packaged appropriately, will then be attached to chain of custody form. So those are your 7 S's. So really quick, secure it, secure the scene, separate the witnesses, scan the scene, see the scene, sketch the scene, search for evidence, secure the evidence. So those are our 7 S's. Alright, so let's say our crime happens outside. Everything, again, has to be documented in its exact location. You're going to rope the area off. You are going to use measurements and fixed points, so maybe the distance to a tree, or a river, or a bush. You're going to have points used and measured from, so you know exactly where evidence was, just like you would inside of a room. All stakes or edges of the crime scene must be at least 1 meter from all pieces of evidence. So if at the corner of one of my scenes I have a piece of evidence, the edges of the scene need to be at least 1 meter in all directions from that piece of evidence to ensure that it's not touched or contaminated in any way. When your scene is sketched of an outdoor crime scene, you also need to be sure you identify north, south, east, and west. After the evidence has finally been collected, all these steps have been followed, it's taken to the lab and analyzed, and this is when our different specialties come into play. Once complete, the results go to the detective, and they're going to use that to piece together the case. Sometimes they may decide to do a crime scene reconstruction, either digitally or in person if they have a space in which to do it. And this is a way where they can recreate the scene, see where things are, and kind of helps come up with a hypothesis of events. So this is once they have an idea of what happened, then they make the reconstruction to see if it's actually logical. So again, reconstructions happen after they have an idea of what happened, and it just kind of makes them think about if it's logical and if it would actually, if their theory could potentially be correct. And again, this can be physical or digital these days. And this leads us to one last topic, which is the idea of a staged crime scene. A staged crime scene is a crime scene that is faked, and it's often used to cover up another more serious crime. So an example would be if someone committed arson or burned down a building to cover up a murder. Or they might make a murder look like a suicide, or they might make a murder try to look like a burglary. And the way that you can figure out if a stage or a scene is staged is to look at wounds. And most importantly, any death is investigated as a homicide or a murder until proven otherwise. So it doesn't matter what it looks like happened. If someone dies, it is investigated as a homicide or a murder, regardless, until there is explicit proof that it wasn't a murder. They make victim profiles. You examine and evaluate the victim and the witness's behavior. Compare statements with the evidence, and possibly make a reconstruction. You want to analyze every possible scenario to see if the crime scene is staged. And again, all deaths, no matter of appearance, are investigated as homicide, just to be sure they're not missing anything, to make sure that every victim has a fair case. So, those are our notes. We will do some practice.